Hey, it's your old pal RP from ASNA. In this video, we're going to take a look at application logging with ASNA Visual RPG. This is one of the things that really drops through the cracks. And if you add good logging, your life, the quality of your life will dramatically increase. Let's take a look at a few things here. Let's take a look at logging in action here. Let's get a different screen up. Let me go to this screen right here. So here is, oh, it's not there, it's here. So here is a log file. And I can make the font bigger in this view. And you can see that we've got a date, time. We've got a log type, and that would include, say, trace, debug, fatal, warning, things like that, various statuses, stati, for a log entry. So we got a bunch of traces, and then down here, we got a fatal, right? There's a fatal error. And this is one of the primary reasons to be using logging, is that you can set up your application so that if an unhandled exception occurs, you can log all of the information about it here. And in this case, the way I've got this configured, it logs the exception and all of the inner exceptions. So we'll talk a little more about that in a little bit. But you can really see what's going on. If the PDB file, the debugging symbols file, is deployed with the application, you can even get line numbers of where the error occurred. Now, obviously, one of the reasons for this is when an error occurs, you don't need to rely on your end user's memory. You don't need to have them tell you, where was I, what was I doing? You can look and see. Now, another reason to use logging is to bake in some tracing or timing things. So notice that we've got every other line here on this button clicked. We've got a line here that says that it took 511 milliseconds, 514, 505. Now, I've always been an advocate for baking in metrics into your application. And it's hard to do. It's really hard to do, and you got to think way ahead. But it's very handy to have. You know those times when users say, hey, the application's running slowly. Wouldn't you like to have a place you can look and see, how was it running a month ago? So with good logging facilities, you can flip a switch and say, hey, start logging the trace entries. Otherwise, it wouldn't be logging them, because they do take milliseconds, but they take some time. You can turn it on and then compare your snapshots. That's another reason to use logging. Another one is for debugging, to be able to show values at runtime, just all kinds of things. Now you see me looking at this log here with Notepad++, and that's an okay way to look at logs, especially if you only look at them occasionally. And I'll show you the links on this in a little bit. But you might want to get you a dedicated log file viewer. Now this one doesn't let me change the size of the font, at least as far as I know, but I can do this. So we're basically looking at the same log file here, but this viewer is sort of dedicated for logs. So it shows you in one color traces, and it shows you fatal errors in red. And it was smart enough to parse this stuff out and figure this out on its own. I didn't even have to tell it the definition of this line, like where the word trace was and all that stuff. Very, very handy. It's free, open source, and there's a link in the, we'll see a link to this in just a little bit. It's also got filtering built into it, so we could come into here and say, let's filter this thing, and let's say we want to filter it on just those timings, or we want to filter it on the important routine measurement. So we'll just come in here and say important routine, and there then we're looking at just those lines. So a good log reader, this is not a good one, it's a fair one. It doesn't have a lot of features other than what we see here, showing logs and filtering them. But there are very good ones. Some of them cost $50 to $100 a seat. And they can get kind of complex with the filters and things that they let you use. But we'll have a link to TailView. I'll show you a link to TailViewer in just a little bit. So that's why to use logging. Now let's take a look at how to use it and what's going on here with it. So let's first go to here. So there's a variety of ways. You know, I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me get something open in front of me here. Let's see here. Whoops. I've got this open in one place, but not in the right place. Okay. I just want to kind of look at my outline and make sure I'm going in the direction I want to be going. So there's many ways to add logging to your application. But one of the things that we need to achieve with logging is that it can't be too invasive or require too much, or it's just not worth putting in there. Now there's many different loggers. Let's go out to NuGet.org. So I'm now at NuGet.org. Let's make that bigger. And if you're not familiar with NuGet, this is a repository of mostly open source add-ons for .NET. There's all kinds of solutions here on NuGet, very popular with .NET programmers. We can come up here and look at statistics, and check this out. This is pretty interesting. We can see that the most frequently downloaded is a JSON, a very popular JSON parser. Pardon me. Look at how many times this thing's been downloaded total since it's been there. 194 million. It almost looks like an IP address, how many times it's been downloaded. Now, we're going to use NLog. Now, NLog has been downloaded 10 million times. Now, that's not probably the most popular logger. And these loggers kind of go in and out of popularity. Right now, the big new kid on the block, the big cool new kid, is SerialLog with 42 million. And it is a very good logger. I find it to be just a little bit on the cumbersome side. And once I dug into NLog, that's kind of the sweet spot for me. It's got just enough to do what I need to do and not a lot of cruft and bells and whistles that I don't need. So, and what I've kind of found out going through NLog and really spending time with it is, having learned it, SerialLog's starting to make a little more sense to me. So maybe you could consider NLog a good entry point, and then maybe later, if you want more features and more things, bump yourself up to something else. But NLog's very good. They're both open source, they're both free. Now, of course, you could use the text file writing capabilities out of system.io and brew your own. But you'll find out very quickly that you need to do more than just write to a file. You don't want this file to grow to an unlimited size, so you need something to scope it, to keep it small, to roll it over. You need lots of basic features, and NLog really excels at making those features available to you. So let's see how to use it. Now, let me show you a couple of links here. The first link that I want to show you is this one right here. Let's blow that up. So GitHub, if you go to GitHub/ASNA, let's just go there first. If you go to GitHub/ASNA, that's a bunch of examples and things. And the one we want to look at is NLog Windows example. So github.com/ASNA, and then you can either click this or go to NLog-Windows-example. Now, by the way, first part of this video, we're just going to look at Windows, at logging with a Windows application, but we're also going to cover briefly logging with ASP.NET. Briefly, because it's almost identical to Windows, just a few minor changes. One of the changes that I think you might do in an ASP.NET application for logging is to also log to the Windows event log. So we'll take a look at that in the web example. But let's go to the NLog Windows example. So most of what I'm telling you is in the README. So you can go back and compare notes and see what's going on with that. So that's your first point of collateral is that github/asna/asna and then NLog Windows examples. Now let's also, while we're at it, let's go to GitHub and let's go to NLog. So this is the NLog GitHub homepage. Click NLog here, and this is the logger that we want to use. Now you'll notice here, back here, if we go back one more time, it's got a bunch of extensions and things. I've never needed any of those. I don't even need this thing here. We're just going to use the basic NLog package and do everything we need to do. And I've read a couple of warnings in some articles that there's a config one, and they say to explicitly not use it. Well, we'll see it in a minute. So this is what we're going to use. Now go to NLog and then go to Wiki. And this is a good place for documentation for it. Most of the good stuff is over here. What do I mean to click that? But then there's also, if you click here, this will take us out to the primary project page and goes into some pretty deep, detailed documentation. You don't need a lot of documentation, and I'd be inclined to say that if you take the config that we build here, the config file for it, you can certainly, it's helpful to look at the documentation, but you won't need very much of it. So let's see here. Let's go to back where we were. I want to go to that wiki page, and I'm going to go to file target. Let's talk about a couple of concepts here. Loggers in general are kind of wrapped around two concepts. They're wrapped around this concept of a target, a place to log things. Now, we're going to log to a text file, but we could also maybe want to log to SQL Server or some other ADO.NET database. We might want to log to a NoSQL database like MongoDB or one of those. We might want to log to email. We might want to log out to Azure to one of its queues. There's many, many places you might want to log to besides just a text file. That's another reason to not try to roll your own, because these things here, a good logger, is very extensive in what it can offer as targets. So if we look at some of the targets here for NLog, we can see that it's got these various fancy targets built into it, databases, and then we can see down here that it integrates with lots of different things. So it's a pretty comprehensive little logger that we're going to be using here. So the concepts are, first of all, a target, a place to write to. And the target that we're going to use today is the text file. That's this guy. And he's kind of baked into NLog, and you don't have to do too much to use him. The other concept is the notion of a layout, what NLog calls a rule. And a rule says it goes in conjunction with a method to write the log. So you'll see that as we go along. Now, if we go to the wiki page and we come over here to file target, we can see then, now if we go over here to the wiki page and we go over here to file target, I'm right there. Go there to that. We can come down here and it's got a very basic, clear at the bottom, near the bottom, a very basic logging configuration. So it doesn't take very much. This is a very, very basic one. Now we're going to have about 6 or 8 lines more than that. But let's go ahead then and hook this thing up using this documentation. And you'll see that it's really pretty straightforward. So we're going to open Visual Studio, and I've got a Windows application stubbed in and ready to run. All I've done so far is say new Windows format, and I put 2 buttons, one that says log a trace statement and one that says cause an exception. So now let's add a configuration file. Now what I'm going to do to begin with, then we're going to go back and customize it, is I'm going to go to my example code now I'm back at GitHub/ASNA NLog Windows example. And I'm going to scroll down to here. And this says very basic NLog configuration. So I'm going to copy that and put it on the clipboard. This is crazy basic. And so now we're going to come into our project. You know, before we, kind of messing you up here. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's do one more thing first. Before we add the configuration, we want to, so I've got a basic Windows application here, and the only thing I've done is created a form and added two buttons, a log trace statement button and a cause exception button. Now, the first thing we want to do to this is to install NLog. So to install NLog, we're going to come up to Tools, NuGet Package Manager, NuGet Package for Solution. Now what this will do is this will let us search that NuGet repository for NLog. Whoops, I didn't spell it right, not even close. Now this messed me up at first when I was installing this the other day. Notice that NLog by itself isn't there, but also notice that my page kind of slipped down a little bit. So don't freak out if you can't find NLog. Just scroll this thing to the top, and there's NLog. So we're going to click it, and then over here, we're going to click Install. Sit back, take a drink of some coffee. Oh, after I click OK. And before I can take a drink of coffee, that bad boy's installed. So what that just did is it went out to the NuGet repository, got the assembly that we need, added it, and even added a reference to it in our project. So if you're not using NuGet, there's a lot of answers to a lot of things that are very helpful out there on NuGet. Now, we've installed NLog. Now let's configure it. So what I'm going to do to configure it is I'm back at GitHub/ASNA/NLog Windows example. In here, we've got a very basic configuration. So let's copy it, and then we'll talk about it. So I'm going to come into here and say add, let's turn our little thing on. I'm going to say add a new item and add a configuration file, application configuration file. I'm going to call it NLog. NLog.config. Click Add. Then I'm going to replace everything that it put in with that basic configuration that you picked up from the GitHub project that accompanies this video. So we copied this. Now let's take a, having dropped that in there, there's something very important to do next. Right-click the file. So I'm up here in the Solution Explorer. Right-click that file and say Properties. If you don't do this, it ain't going to work. Change the build action to Content and change the Copy to Output directory to Copy Always. What those two things do is tell Visual Studio that this is only content, but it also says put it in the bin folder of this application when you compile it. So it'll always have at runtime the config available to the NLog assembly. That's where it expects to find it. Very important to do those two things. If you don't, you'll be #sad. Now let's close that. And I don't like that it doesn't have a save button, but it's stuck. It's sticky when you make those changes. So now what we've got then is the basic XML config file. If you look at the docs for NLog, you can also configure it in code. It's not documented as well configuring it in code, so my preference is to document it in XML. Now we only need to do two things. We need to define a target and we need to define a rule. So this target says we're creating, we're doing the type, the target type is a file, text file. And that basically comes from here where we're saying, when we looked at this guy's targets, let's come back to here for a minute. Let's go to the wiki. When we looked at his targets, that file, so what we're doing is that file there relates to that Word file here. That's the type of target we're creating. It might say CSV file, and you can look at the documentation for what they call the others, SQL Server, database, all that stuff, email. Now we're naming this target log file. We just made that name up. We could call it Tom Petty if we wanted to. We're going to call it log file. Log file, it's logging, this is the file type, and then what's the file name? In this case, it's Warren Zevon, just for the purposes of playing around. Now, that defines that. Now, it's insanely basic. That's like the minimum you need. We're going to add to it here in a minute. Now, this is where we will invoke the logger to actually write to the log file. This will facilitate writing to the log file. So we're calling this rule myLogger, and let's look at something here on the documentation page again. If we go back to here, go back to the wiki, and go down to File Target, the categories of logging that NLog supports are trace, debug, info, warn, error, and fatal. And that's the categories in the level of severity. So we can set this up to where we can write any of those categories, any of those types to the log. Now, we also have a switch we flip that says, even though the logging code is in our application, if all we want it to do is to write from warn on, then it will ignore anything above this. So typically what we do is put as much logging in you want with all of these different statuses, all these different categories of logging, but then set it so that normally when the application is running, it's only going to do maybe error and fatal, and you don't have these other things turned on. Then when it comes time to maybe do some tracing, to do some measurements, you flip it so it says always do trace. Now what we've got here is, in our application, we've got it set to say the minimum level is trace. So what that means is when we write to this, it's always going to write trace and down to the log file. So effectively this says write everything when it's running. And I'll show you what we mean by that here in just a minute. So now let's do this. We've got this stuff up and running. We've said write from trace down. That means put them on disk, put them in the log file. Now let's go to our code, and we're going to do a couple of things. I'm going to go into the code, and the first thing we want to do is up here, we want to say using NLog. Remember, using NuGet, that put that reference in there for us. Then we're going to, now this is kind of specific to Windows. I'm going to inform load. I'm going to instance this. Oh, I didn't declare it. I need to come up here and put, now this is global to the class. So I'm declaring a log up here, and it's of type NLogger. And then here I'm instancing it. So when this form comes to life, it'll instance this log and have it available to every routine in this class. Now the log manager class, that comes to us through NLog, he's got a getLogger method, and notice that we named our log myLogger. So over here, we're saying get me an instance of myLogger. We may have many rules and many targets, and so depending on which one you instance, that's what we're writing to. We'll see more about that in just a little bit. And now, let's see. Now we're ready to write a log. So we can do something really goofy simple by going into here and saying, now today is the 2nd of December. So what I'm going to do is go out and hide something from you. I've already got some logs being written. I'll do it in front of you so you don't think I'm cheating. I want to save that log. I'm just going to name it save. So today is the 2nd of December. Oh, it's not going to do that there anyway because we're doing it to Warren Zevon. We're going to Warren Zevon. So let me go out there. I probably already have him because I was testing this. So let's go to programming, AVI. I could have done this another way. There it is. And if I go to bin, debug, there's Warren Zevon. That's from me testing it. So now we'll keep that out of the way for a minute. All right, now we'll run this application. Now if we're living right, what I expect to happen here is I'm going to make this guy stay on top, courtesy of Windows Power Tools. And I'm going to click log trace statement. And I expect to see it immediately throw out a log file. So it, without me doing anything but writing about 5 lines of code, now I'm logging to a file. So now if we go in here and look at this guy, it says at 12:08 on 12:02, it was a trace. We used my logger and button click. Now this is the default message. We didn't define anything special there, but that's what it did. And so, oh, and this is telling me this is an in notepad thing. So I'm going to close that guy. Oh, I didn't mean to do that. Let's go back to here. So now that code then log that guy like that. Now, I can do it a bunch of times, and if I do it that many times, now if we come over here and look, now what we're going to see is that we've got that many trace entries. All right, let's see something else here. Let's just drag him over here for a minute, and let's add another thing. Let's go into here, and right here, let's put let's do a debug. So now when I click the button, it's going to write a trace entry and a debug entry. Now remember, we've got our logger configured to always write trace on down. So, and by on down, I mean those different log levels. So let's run it. I'll hit it 3 times. It's over here, it's right there. 1, 2, 3, I'll close it. And now if I refresh my notepad, now we just showed debug and trace statements in the logger. Now, let's do this. Let's get rid of all those lines in that wall and save it. So now we got an empty file sitting out there. We could delete the file. Now I'm going to set this down to say debug only. Now remember, let's go back to here for a minute. If we look at its orders of severity are trace, debug, info, warn, error, and fatal. So notice that debug is under trace. So I'm going to set this to debug, and that means even if it encounters trace statements in the code, it won't write those. It won't execute that effectively. So let's compile it and run it. And I'll hit it 3 times again. 1, 2, 3. If we come over here, all it logged then was from debug on down. So it didn't log the trace. So what that means is that we can add lots of critical trace statements in here, but not have them garbage up the log, not have it take the time to write them, because it does take some time to write them, not much. It's negligible, but if it was doing tons of it, if you're reading 1 million records and you're writing 4 logs every time, that's a lot of I/O. Pardon me. So that's a good way to scale it, to scope it. Now, for a Windows application, you don't really need to change this at runtime. You just start the application, you change it and run the exe again. On a web application, though, you might want to deploy it in your config file with debug. Well, NLog can be configured to say, watch for changes to this config file, and if you change this at runtime from debug to trace, it'll automatically start logging traces. So you have the ability on a web app to change that tracing level at runtime without starting and stopping the web application, and it does what it needs to do. So the benefit there might be somebody's got something goofy going on and you want to try to capture that while it's running. So you can change that at runtime. You could do that on a web app, but I don't think it makes sense to do that. The web app a Windows app, what I meant to say was, you can do that in a Windows app, but I don't think that makes sense in a Windows application. Okay, so that's the concept. That's the basic thing. And really with that, run with it on your own. But let's go ahead and look at something here that we can define the target a little better with. So let's I'm going to go here. Now this code is in that GitHub thing, but I'm going to copy it here. So I'm going to replace my configuration with something that is, I think, a little better configuration. Now it's a little bit longer, but we do several things here. The first thing we do is, let's just kind of go through it. Here's a handful of global configuration things. So this is what I was just talking about. If this was a web app and that said true, that would say reload this file every time the XML file changes, every time the config file changes. That's very handy. Throw exceptions true generally should be set to false. What that means is, and this is kind of a decision that you got to make. NLog will swallow its own exceptions if you keep this at false. So for example, let's say that your logging mechanism was logging to SQL Server. Your log target was SQL Server. And let's say that for whatever reason SQL Server was down while your app was running. Well, do you want your application to die because it can't log to SQL Server? If you do, set this to true. And when NLog attempts to connect to SQL Server and it can't, boom, it blows up, your app dies. But keeping this to false kind of protects your application from NLog failures. Generally, it should be set to false. Now, this is kind of important. Throw config exceptions. Leave that to true, because what that'll do for you is if that's false, any errors that you have in this config file are going to be swallowed and it'll drive you nuts. So leave that to true. Now then, here's the other interesting thing, and this is very important. Notice that the internal log level is off and the internal log file is set to a file name. Now think this through. NLog itself has its own little logging engine that logs its stuff to a file. Now usually you don't need it, but especially as you're configuring it and learning what's going on, you might make a mistake in the configuration. For example, leave this E off. Well, that's not going to work because the XML doc is expecting that to be file. So if we have this set to true, log exceptions, and if we have this set to trace, I always set it to the lowest level trace. What that'll do is it'll put a whole bunch of stuff out there in this log for the configuration of NLog. So these guys here relate to debugging your configuration. Very handy to use. We don't need it right now, but it's very handy to have. So there we go. Very handy to use. Now you can read more about that in the documentation. Now the next thing we do here is NLog lets us define some variables. So what we're doing is defining a variable named log level with a value of trace. And what we're doing with that is down here in the lower part of the config file, it's going to use that variable here. So that's going to say, if that says trace, this is going to say trace. And it's debatable whether you want to do this or not. I like to have this up out of the syntax of this so that at runtime, you can just double click this, change that to debug, and you know you're changing that thing if it were a web app. But this is going to govern the log level. And the way I would generally write it is all my loggers would use that guy. It kind of depends on how sophisticated your logging model is. So currently that would say log everything. And maybe we don't want to do that. Well, let's do that for now. Now, otherwise, the rules is the same as what we had before. Not really much to it. It's got a name, it's got a minimum level, and it's got a write to. Now, you can also have a maximum level. I don't know that I would ever do this. Well, actually, I can think of a time when I would. You might want to do this. You might want to have if you had a max level of trace, so the minimum level was trace and the maximum level was trace, the only thing it would write to the log are the trace statements. So if we were using it to get some metrics, some telemetry on your application and its performance with some log things you got baked in, that might be something you want to think about doing. All right, now let's take a look at this. Here, instead of just giving it a file name, I'm saying special folder equals application data, and notice this $. This is the NLog syntax for the substitution of that. So what special folder is, special folder equal application data, is what I'm telling it is that for this Windows application, I want it to log to C users Roger application data, app data, that's this guy right here, and then roaming. So this is, if you say, let's see if we can get this to where, let's get this guy here, and oops, not him. Yeah, pardon me, him. And let's make him stay on top for a minute. So if you say, I know it's kind of hard to read. I'm going to magnify that for you here. Whoops, magnifying the wrong thing. So users, username, app data roaming, that's what you get when you say special folder application data. And then notice how I'm saying WinApp logs. So if I come down here to WinApp, so I'm telling it with this line of code, I'm telling it to log to that path out there for this application. So you would have what the concept is this would be the name of the application, and then this is its logs, and you may even have other files in here, config files and things for the application that you could go out and fetch from there. That's probably the way I would do it for Windows application all the time. Application name and then logs. And now we can see that the short date .log is going to be the name of the file. So year, month, day, log, and then it'll just keep writing to it. Now this next thing here, I've experimented with it both ways. And for performance purposes, you can say true. But if you say true to keep the file open, you have to put some code in your application to close the log to ensure you catch anything that's buffered and hasn't yet been written. So I'm keeping it at false right now. I'll show you the line of code here in a minute. I'm keeping it at false, but for a web application or something, you might want to leave it at true. I don't know. Watch for performance on that. Now the layout, I'm not going to go too much into this. This layout, when we study the documentation for NLog, and we go here to the layouts, you can really dig into its capabilities and what it lets you do. right here. So it really goes into all of the values and all of the things that are there in that config. But we'll take a look at what I'm using here. What I'm saying here is long date, the date and time effectively, and then the uppercase value of the level, and then the message I want, and then if there's an exception, throw it. And then if you read the docs a little bit and talk about how to log exceptions, it basically gives you this code here. I didn't have to explain it or understand it. Understand it. I just snagged that code out of it to log inner exceptions. So this is basically using these replaceable tokens to build the message you want to get. By default, it was building that piped separated thing, and this is not going to do that. This is going to make one like that. Now, in addition then, and you'll see that in just a moment, in addition to the file name, we've also got an archive file name. And what this means is, what I'm saying here is, if the archive file gets to be bigger than 5 meg, then roll it over. And what it'll do is, as soon as it hits 5 meg, it'll start appending numbers to it and copying it out so that it takes care of all that rolling and all that stuff that manages that log file so it doesn't get huge. I'm also saying archive it every day. So every day we're going to get a new log to start with. And I'm saying the maximum number of those archives to keep is 14. Keep me for 2 weeks. So whatever your application demands, that's what you do. Now, it could be, I think, my intention is, you don't really have to understand this layout, just use the darn thing. But you can go dig into the docs, build your own layouts, and otherwise it's pretty straightforward. This was a little fiddly. I had to go to a Stack Overflow answer to really kind of get what worked the best here, and I think that's probably a good place to do it, good way to do it. And now we're done. Now let's see what happens here if we do this. And I think we can see that logging in action. If we change that from 5 million to 20,000, say 2,000, see what happens. Now let's go to this guy here. So there I am. Let's make this stay on top. Here I am in this guy here showing what we're logging to. We're currently set to log to trace, and we currently have trace and debug. So let's run it. I'm going to click this button. I'm going to click the log trace button, and I expect to see the log file occur there. So let's bring this over to here. And I got some old logs here. Let's get rid of this log. I don't want to. So notice that I do not have a 2002-1202 log. I got that one I'm saving, but I don't need to save really because we're going to recreate it right now. Okay, so now let's run this guy. Got this thing staying on top. So now I'm going to click it, and I expect over here to see a 1202 appear. There we go. And so now that just logged trace and debug, but now they look a little bit different than the other one did. Oh, forgot to tell you something about that logger. So there we can see that that's the full date, the log type in uppercase, and then the message, that's my message. And then the other thing I added to that config was I think it might come in handy, is the stack trace. I got to digging through the docs and I saw that, so that seems like it might be a good thing to have in there. And that's what this is, the stack trace, so you can kind of tell where you were and what happened. That might not be necessary, you can kind of decide. But you'll notice that none of this exception stuff went out there because an exception didn't happen. Now, this gets interesting because Windows applications typically don't have global exception handlers. So let me show you what I mean by that. If we force an exception, now I could just throw an exception, but I don't want to do that. Because I want to see the exception detail. So now if I do put this line of code in there, now let's run it. Got it right here. And when I click that button, let's log a couple of times. When I click this button, an exception occurred. Now, watch here. We come over here to the log. No exception got logged. Nothing happened. Well, why didn't it? Because we didn't tell it to, right? We didn't say, hey, log that value. So what we could do, now I'm going to show you the alternative here in just a second. What we could do is do this, and then let's snag one of these. But I'm going to call that the fatal error. And then in there, I'm going to put the exception message. Now that'll let us capture it. I know what you're thinking. You got to go do that everywhere. Well, watch. Let's first of all see it. Log tree statement a couple times, and then the exception. Now what we're expecting to see is we handled that exception. Probably we should have thrown it. But there then is our fatal exception where it attempted to divide by 0. Let's think about this for a minute. If you're going to use this logging, it would be really great if you didn't have to do so that it's not invasive. Let me show you how to make it not invasive. It is minorly invasive. But you know how in a Windows application, if you look at a project's properties, it has the startup object in the properties, in the application properties. And this is telling it, start with Form 1. Well, I'm going to do something a little bit different here. I'm going to right-click this guy. This doesn't really have anything to do with logging, but I'm going to say add a class. The class that I'm going to add is startup.vr. Could be named anything. And then in that class, I'm going to give it this code here. So what I've done is I've added a startup class so that the entry point is going to be here, not Form 1. We're going to instance Form 1, and we're going to instance our logger. We're going to show the Form 1 dialog as a modal. That's what you got to do when you're setting it up like this. And then if an exception occurs anywhere in anything from F1 down, so if F1 calls another form or whatever any of those guys do, this will take care of that. And there is that line of code to shut down the logger explicitly if you keep the file open. I just put it there to have it there to discuss it. And then finally, then we dispose of the form. So now we got to change one thing. If you add this to your Windows application, the other thing you want to remember is go over here to Properties and say, don't start there. Don't start in the Form 1, start with main. Now, what we can do is without anything. You don't have to add anything to any of your other forms. Just change that startup slightly. And some of you are already doing this, so you could just put this inside this exception here. But if you're not, it's easy to add. And now if we run it, we should see things working. Now we need to look at two things here. Let's get our log file back up there. App data, roaming WinApp. Let's kind of clear things out a little bit. I'm just going to clear all that. So we currently don't have anything in WinApp logs. We're starting all over again. Let's keep him on top. And I'm going to start it. The first thing we're going to do is look at that log file rolling over. Remember that we configured it to say if your 20,000 bytes or more roll over. So let's see that in action first. So I'm going to do a log statement. And there it is. And if we pull this thing out, now watch what happens here. This is cool. Do that a few times. Wait for it to catch up on me. I'm getting it up to 20. Come on, baby. Come on, baby. Here, I'm watching right here for that to get to 20. So I'm just clicking that button a whole bunch of times. I'm getting close. 20, 20, 20. Come on, baby. Okay, now I just clicked it over to 20. So what it did is it rolled that file over. So it pushed it to archive, appended a 0 to it. So this is the 0th archive. And now what we got here is where it starts off. And so we can look at this and see that what's going on here? Oh. Notepads tell me I want to reload that thing. So we can see that the primary log started up at 12:54, well, at 50 minutes 95 milliseconds, or whatever that is. And then if we look at the archive, the last entry in it will be shortly before that, 5450, and the other one was 5450-921 and 5450-4692. So by using this archive above size and rolling and then maximum archive files, that'll cause that thing to roll over. And by doing archive every day, you'll get a new primary log for every day of the week. Okay, now that was that. Let's end it, and let's see our implicit exception now. Let's make this be 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. So now let's see our exception. Let's just get everything out of the way again. We're back up to something reasonable in the size. And so now when we run it, click this guy a few times. And then if we cause an exception, boom, the exception occurred. We're in Startup VR, so we showed our form, but as soon as it fired an exception, raised an exception, it kicks in, it gets the logger, it logs our error message, it flushes it, which is probably not necessary if we've got that false on there for the file close in the config, this guy right here. And then it shows us this guy, and then it disposes with the form. And so now we should be able to come over here and see right there. We should come over here and see, let's close that dialog. That shuts things down. There then is our exception that got logged. So you can see fatal right there. And so if we look at it with the free tail viewer, log viewer that I mentioned. Let's get rid of that filter. Look at how it shows the exception error in red, and you can see this stuff. And so we could come up here and say, just show me the fatal errors. Turn this stuff off. And these guys here are smart enough to show you what's going on there. That's pretty cool. One fatal. I think we can turn that off. Oh, it's not going to let you with those three showing. Anyway, it's kind of cool, and it's free, and it's really easier. I haven't found a way to make the font bigger, and for an old man, the font is pretty darn small. I sound like a get off my lawn kind of guy, don't I? So there you go, NLog in action for Windows. Now, that's the end of Windows, at least as we've got it right now. Remember, you can go out to github.com/ASNA, NLog-Windows example. And all this gobbledygook is written down in that README as well, or most of it. And that'll get you started. So if you're doing Windows, you're done. You're excused from class. If you want to do web, stick with me. I'm going to append a little bit to this video to show you the two different things that apply probably to web applications with NLog. Otherwise, everything we see here does apply to web applications. So thanks for viewing if you're stepping away from your classroom desktop. In the first part of this video, we looked at using NLog with a Windows application. Now in this part of the video, we'll look at using NLog with an ASNA Visual RPG ASP.NET application. First thing we need to talk about is global exception handling in a web application. Now, if you're not familiar with global exception handling, out here in the GitHub example for this application, which is at github.com/asna/nlog-web-example. That URL right there. In that GitHub example project, in that GitHub repo, there is a Microsoft link to web forms exception handling, global error handling, and there's also a link to a dedicated repository in GitHub about global exception handling. We're not going to cover it directly, but you'll kind of see what's going on with it. So that's the first thing we need to talk about. Then what we're going to talk about is logging to the Windows event log. This is above and beyond NLog, but it might be a good idea for a web server administrator to be able to look in the event log for web application errors. And then we'll look at using NLog to log the error to NLog. So let's first of all open up the project, the example project. So here we are. Global application exception error handling is done through the global ASAX. Now we're going to copy that global ASAX to clipboard and then delete it. So you can watch me putting it in here. So let's, now I'm going to say in my web project, I'm going to say add new item. And if you've not got a global ASAX, the global event handler for your ASP.NET web application, you come down here and you add a global application class, and that names the file global.asax. And if you click add, that throws in the template, effectively the empty one, and I'm just going to paste it with what I know it needs. So here's kind of what happens with global exception handling in an ASP.NET web application. You go to this application event handler that we just added, and it's got events for application start, application end, session start, session end, some user sign-on stuff, things like that. The thing we're interested in, the event that we're interested in, is the application error event. When this event is present, this is where control is directed to when an unhandled exception error occurs. In our application, I've got an unhandled exception error hard-coded into it in page load. So without even showing us a page, it's going to try to do a divide by 0, and that'll give us the error we need to test this. Now, typically, if you go look at the Microsoft Docs with the link I just showed you, or the example, AVR example, the first thing we do is capture the error. And then the next thing we do is capture the last error thrown. Then the Microsoft Docs recommend that we put everything inside this test if the exception is an unhandled exception. I'm not sure that's necessary because I don't think you can get here if it's not an unhandled exception. But I'll keep the docs happy and put that there. Now this is the part of the code that we'll look at that does the logging to the event log, and then this is the part of code that logs to the logger. And you know, I'm going to go ahead and put that back right there. Put this line here, and that shuts down the logger when we're done. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. Now, before we continue though, to be able to log to the event log, we need to put a custom event log out there. So we're going to call it our cool web app event log. So here's how we do that. You do that with PowerShell. And in the GitHub repo, it's got a little section on some PowerShell commands that let you do that. So we're going to use this PowerShell command, new event log, to create a new event log. Now let's open up the event viewer. Event viewer takes about 2 sips of coffee to load up. Maybe 1 sip. And so there we are. Got it all loaded up. And you can see that there is no, what I call it, I called it cool web app. You can see that there is no cool web app entry here, and nor do you see it over here. So let's run our PowerShell command. Now to run a PowerShell command, let me close this and start this back up. To run a PowerShell command, go down to the bottom left down there in Windows and search for PowerShell. And then right click it and run as administrator. And I think I've got the command on the clipboard. Well, let's get this guy turned off for a minute. Make that font a lot bigger. Yeah, I put that on the clipboard. So what we're going to do is run this PowerShell command from an administrator PowerShell session. And it's going to create a log named cool web app, and this thing called source, it's going to set it to production. We'll talk more about source in a moment. It's effectively what the source was for these errors. And typically you might have one for production and one for development, things like that. We're just going to call this one production. I'm going to press enter. And now that will have created a new event log. Now let's do this. We probably can refresh it, but not always. So what I like to do is after I add a new custom event log, close the event log viewer and open it again. It seems a little finicky about that. And I think the most reliable thing to do is just shut it down and open it back up. And when we do that, oh, should have taken a sip of coffee. Then when we open it, notice that now we've got our cool web app event log in there. Now there's no entries in it yet. And this source column is what will reflect the word production here in just a little bit. So you might have another source that you maybe is dev, where you're doing development on that same web server. So now we've got our event log in there. And that's good. Now we'll minimize that viewer for a little bit. And we'll run our app here in just a moment. I want to point out one more thing before we run it, and we'll kind of run it, see it in action once, and then look at the code. The other thing I want you to notice that there is no logs folder. The primary difference between using NLog with Windows apps and web apps is where you put the NLog file itself. In Windows applications, we typically put it in the application data folder. So this is a line of code that we used to specify where to put that log in Windows. Well, what we're going to do in the web app, we're going to put it in the base directory,
which means put it in the root. Now that's the primary difference, and we'll take another look at this in just a moment in the config. So what I want you to notice is when we run this app, notice there is no logs folder, and NLog will put that logs folder there for us, so we don't need to put it there. So let's run this. It's going to cause an error right away. And it's compiling. There's our error. Fatal error occurred. Notice that there's not much information here on this. You shouldn't put too much error information on this page. Bad guys could use it to maybe do something evil. So now what we'll do is close that. Come over here and refresh our folders, and there we can see that we got an NLog log, and there then is, we'll take a closer look at this in a little bit, but there is an error we had logged, and here's our fatal exception with the innermost exception showing first. Oh, pardon me. In this case, it shows the inner exception down here. We'll take a look at that in a second. So there is our error that's been logged. Maybe it would make more sense to look at it this way. And we'll come back and review this in a little bit. I want to talk first of all about this Windows event log. So if we go to our event log viewer, and we go to our My Cool app, what we're expecting to see then now is an error logged to My Cool web app, and we can see then that there's the error message, and you can notice that the exceptions are listed innermost first. If you're not familiar with the concept of inner exception, we'll look at that in just a moment. So there we've got this logged. So what this means then is an administrator of the web server could keep watch on the event log viewer, and when they see something wrong, they can see that a fatal error happened, and then they get the message to go look in the logs directory, what we just looked at, to see more detail. Now, let's look at the code to do that event log stuff. Then we'll look at NLog. So if we go back to global ASAX, this is where control got passed when the exception error occurred. And this is the code. So right here, when control gets passed to here, this is where we get. Let's just press F5 here and run this and just follow the debugger. This is probably the best way to look at this. Now we'll press F10, and what that did is it fetched the last error. Now we'll notice that the last error was kind of a generic one. Web exception, unhandled exception was thrown. Well, if we look at that closer, we'll notice that he's got an inner exception. Now I can't magnify that. I know it's kind of hard to see, but that says inner exception, and here it says divide by 0. So in almost every case, I think it's fair to say that the inner exception shows the most relevant detail. Now for NLog, it'll just show all of the exceptions for us, and you don't have to traverse the tree looking at the exceptions. However, to put that message in the event log, to put this message here, we need to do a little more work. So let's look at the code here. So here we are, we've captured that event. Let's step on through it, SF11. So the first thing we're going to do is we're going to create an instance of the system.diagnostics event log class. That gives us everything we need to write to the Windows event log. And we instance it writing to the cool web app event log. That's the event log we created with PowerShell. And then we get the error text that we want to put into that message for that event log. And we call this routine here. So let's go see what's happening. Notice we passed the exception. Well, that's the top level exception. That's the one that at top says an unhandled exception occurred. I'll press F11. And so what I'm doing here is fetching all of the detail and building the message that we want to put in the event log, the message we want to put here. That's what we're building with this get error text. So we're pushing all the text we want in the string builder into a string builder. The first two lines are here. And then we collect accept messages by innermost first, because what I want to do is I want to show the operator the most important, or what's probably the most important first. And the way we kind of reorder those, because they're in backwards order, they're outer and then inner. We want them inner to out. So we call this this method here, collect exceptions by innermost first, and all it does is iterate over them. So while the exception is equal to nothing, just keep looping through it, pushing messages onto a stack, and then assigning the inner exception to that, so that when he leaves, let's just step through that. And now if we look at messages, this is a stack, and there we can see that the top message is divided by 0, and then the second one is the outer one. So it's innermost first. And that then built that for us. So here we continue then to build up our message, and let's just go ahead and press F11. And what we'll see then is we end up getting a message that says exactly what we want it to say in the event log viewer. Now, so really, you don't need but that much code to capture and write a message to the event log. Here we're setting the source, and that's what then gets reflected here in this source column. And then we're just writing the entry with the message we sent it. Now you do need these two gobbledygook routines right here. Get error text and collect exception messages by innermost first. But those would work in any application, so those are not generic. If you're going to do this a lot, maybe put those as static members in something. But this then is all of the code necessary to write to the event log. Now typically you don't write lots of detail to that. You just write enough to let the web server administrator know something happened, go look in the log for more detail. And you don't really get the chance to put a lot of detail here. It gets grungy pretty quickly, but that's why we're using NLog as well. So this is the code that wrote to NLog. Pardon me, this is the code that wrote to the Windows event log. Doesn't have anything to do with NLog, but it works in conjunction with it nicely. Now, we didn't do this in the Windows app, mostly because those Windows machines aren't typically monitored by a single admin. They're not always, looking at that event viewer for any specific user's event logs. Probably makes a lot more sense to put this in a web app than it does a Windows app, but you could also put it in a Windows app if you want to. And then we come along, and then the next two lines are what's responsible for logging this to the NLog logger, the NLog log file. We get an instance of the logger just exactly like we did in Windows, and we write the message just exactly like we did in Windows. And then we issue this NLog manager shutdown, we clear the error, and we do a redirect out to the error page. So let's just step through those. Whoops. And then I'm going to press F10 there, and there's our error page. Now, the Microsoft docs suggest that you use server.transfer and not response.redirect. I prefer to use response.redirect because server.transfer doesn't change that URL. And I've had a lot of trouble with users getting confused on that. Another reason they have you use server.transfer is with it, you can reach back into the thing that happened before the server.transfer and fetch some objects out of memory like the last exception. But we're not going to put any detail on this page. We don't have to reach back to do anything. So I just do a response.redirect to the error page, then redirect them back to a home page or something, and make sure I'm logging detail somewhere. Because we are logging this detail. Let's go ahead and end it. We did log all this detail here for them to look at, and if we have the PDB file deployed with this application, you even get line numbers. So we're telling them what class it happened in, what's going on, a lot of information. And we didn't have to do anything to iterate over the inner and additional exceptions with NLog. It does all that itself. We only have to do that for the event viewer. Now, the only difference in configuration between Windows and web is in the NLog config, and we've already looked at it. It's in using base directory instead of let me show you here. It's using the base directory, which causes it to put the log file in the root, as opposed to in Windows, we use the application data folder. So that's really all there is to it. That's the difference. One is that it's kind of nice to log to the event log viewer, and the other is that you configure it to write to the base dir, which means the root of this project, and then the logs file under the base directory. So that's it. That's the difference between Windows and web. It's really easy to use in either case. I did skip over the fact that in this project, I had already done the tools, NuGet package manager, manage NuGet packages for solution, and I had already loaded the NLog project, just the NLog NuGet package, just like we did in Windows. So really for web work, it's almost identical. The only difference is you might want to optionally log to the event log viewer and to the Windows event log, and you configure it to write to the base directory of the project. So that's it. Give NLog a look. It's really valuable and helpful. Thank you.